Hello and welcome to Vegas Aces Q&A. I'm your host, Heather Ferris, and on today's episode, I will be interviewing Dr. Ahlgren, who is a Penn State professor in gaming and hospitality, and we will discuss the 15th International Conference on Gaming and Risk-Taking, which was held in May of 2013. So, let's get started. Dr. Ahlgren, thank you very, very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
You are a professor at Penn State. You have a PhD in Gaming and Hospitality. You have worked at the American Gaming Association, and you were the manager of operations at Harrah's Research Center.
Correct.
Now, you recently have presented in the 15th International Conference for Gaming and Risk-Taking. You gave several presentations during this conference. Can you summarize what you talked about during the conference?
I can try. It's sort of a long and winding road. My first presentation, I was really a secondary author on a paper. A colleague of mine that I went through the PhD program, she actually did it a little bit before me. And it's really, that paper is on superstitions, comparing Asian gamers, and when I say Asian, Japanese gamers to Korean gamers to Chinese gamers to North American gamers, so to speak, and comparing their different superstitions and their motivations for when they play. My other two presentations are more things that I'm directly involved in, and one of them is a paper that I worked on with Dr. Bo Bernhardt, again, the director of the International Gaming Institute, and we've done a couple papers on intellectual capital in the gaming industry, and the basis for that paper is asking the question: as the worldwide gaming market changes, you have proliferation of gaming in both domestically in the U.S. and internationally, what's going to happen to Las Vegas? Sort of the first step that we took that was really Bo's position was let's take a look to Houston, because Houston's an interesting case study in that Houston was the center of the domestic oil industry. And then in the 70s, that oil industry essentially dried up in Texas. But rather than turning into one of the North Nevada ghost town for mining, Houston was able to transform itself from this domestic center of gaming. It's really the intellectual capital that's coming out of Houston that's informing these decisions. Sort of our premise was, well, what can Las Vegas learn from Houston? So how can Las Vegas transform itself from the center of the domestic gaming industry to sort of a center of intellectual capital for the worldwide gaming industry? And we're really in the early stages. We've sort of identified that as a premise. Now we're trying to determine how we can measure intellectual capital. So if we want to improve ourselves, we've got to figure out how to measure it. And part of that is just defining what do we mean when we say intellectual capital. So it was a panel presentation, and Bo and Jonathan Galovitz spoke about the Houston scenario, the degree to which Las Vegas already does inform the actions of both Macau and Singapore. John Galovitz spoke to that. And then I came in and I spoke about, well, if we're going to push ahead with this and we're going to start to measure it, how are we going to do it? What do we really mean when we say it? It's just a fancy term to say. Everyone you say intellectual capital. They go, wow. But what does that mean? And that's what we're trying to tackle right now.
What does intellectual capital mean then?
Well, it has a number of different components. Well, part of it is just your human talent. So how educated your workforce is. If you're talking about, for example, well, let's be critical for a second. If you're talking about Las Vegas, how many brilliant people are there that are available to the industry here in Las Vegas? And part of that is driven by if you're a young executive or a young graduate coming out of an MBA program from Wharton or from Harvard or from one of the top schools, one thing they're going to ask themselves is, like, do I want to move my maybe young family to Las Vegas? And to be critical for a second, well, one of the things they're going to ask is, how good is the school system? And that's, I think everyone would agree that's something that needs to be improved around here. Houston spends a lot of time has spent a lot of time worrying about that, how to make the city attractive to outsiders that are coming in. And I mean, we have a number of executives here in Las Vegas that don't live here. They essentially commute in for their work week. And really, you would hope that these are the executives that ought to be investing in making Vegas a better place and making sure that the schools are good enough for their kids and what have you. So there's some work to be done, no question. So there's that human education element. Other elements are, access to capital. Las Vegas has been pretty good at that. Probably too good for its own good, as is, evident by the city center. I think they got more money than they really knew what to do with at that point, and they probably overinvested because there was so much capital available to some of these companies in the mid 2000s. So that's an element of it. How wired you are, that's another one. There's a number of different components. How much money is being spent on R&D, for example, in a community? That would be an aspect when you're starting to measure intellectual capital. You would measure that. How many patents are being issued? Now, in the gaming industry, maybe that's not appropriate. So that's just it, is that we're still at that stage trying to figure out what exactly do we measure, and it's a little bit subjective. It's a little bit qualitative. It's not just cut and dry.
Right.
Otherwise, I could figure it out in an afternoon. But it's going to take some, discussion, and now there's a bunch of people weighing in on it, and hopefully, that's where we're headed. Part of it's due to the fact that it's just kind of a new concept, a little, even though it's, they started studying in the 70s, but academia moves very slowly. So it's now we're talking about what we're proposing is that we do it not for a country or a single company. We're talking about doing it sort of for the Las Vegas gaming industry, both the technology side of it and the operator side of it, and so it's kind of new. So that's part of the challenge.
That does it for today's show. If you have a question that you want answered, then please submit it in the comments section below. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Remember to subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.